Have you ever found yourself staring at your phone, waiting for a call that never comes? You raised them, sacrificed for them, gave them everything you could, yet somehow you feel invisible in their lives. The question burns in your chest late at night. Why doesn't my child value me? It's a pain that cuts deeper than any physical wound, leaving you questioning not just your parenting, but your very worth as a person. You wonder if all those years of putting their needs first somehow made you disappear in their eyes. The silence from the person you love most in this world feels like a verdict on your entire life. This isn't about ungrateful children or failed parenting, though that's what your inner critic whispers in the dark. The truth is far more complex and surprisingly more hopeful than you might imagine. Sometimes the very love that drove your sacrifices creates invisible barriers between you and your child. The ways we express devotion don't always translate into the connection we desperately seek. Understanding this disconnect isn't about finding fault, but about finding a path back to each other. When we examine these patterns with honest eyes, we often discover that love was never the problem. Across generations and circumstances, certain patterns repeat themselves in families everywhere. Parents who gave everything find themselves feeling unappreciated, while children who received that everything struggle to see the person behind the provider. The invisible sacrifices that shaped your child's world may have simultaneously erased your presence from it. These aren't conscious choices on anyone's part, but rather the unintended consequences of love expressed through self-denial. The parent who disappears into their role as caregiver can become invisible even to those they care for most. Recognition begins when we understand that sacrifice without self-preservation often defeats its own purpose. Today, you'll discover why some of the most loving parents feel the most unseen by their children. We'll explore how material provision can create emotional distance, how unspoken expectations breed resentment, and how the very act of putting others first can make you last in their considerations. You'll see how patterns from your own childhood might be playing out in ways you never realized. Most importantly, you'll learn that feeling undervalued doesn't mean you are without value, and that understanding these dynamics is the first step toward healing them. The stories ahead will show you that you're not alone in this struggle, and, more importantly, that it's never too late to change the pattern. Your pain is real, but it's not permanent, and the relationship you long for with your child is still possible. The answer isn't found in doing more of what isn't working, but in understanding why it isn't working in the first place. Through honest reflection and gentle courage, you can begin to reclaim not just your relationship with your child, but your relationship with yourself. The journey toward being truly seen begins with seeing yourself clearly. If this resonates with you, I hope you'll like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating these precious but complex relationships. Let me share a story that shows what I mean. In a small rural town where everyone knows everyone else's business, Evelyn sits alone on her weathered front porch as the sun sets behind distant hills. At 52, she has spent the better part of 3 decades working double shifts at the local diner, her hands permanently stained with coffee and her back perpetually aching from hours on her feet. The lines around her eyes tell the story of a woman who has smiled through exhaustion more times than she can count, always for the sake of someone else. Her small house, modest but meticulously maintained, stands as a testament to years of careful budgeting and quiet sacrifice. The silence that surrounds her now feels heavier than the physical fatigue she's carried for so long. Every evening follows the same pattern. She checks her phone hopefully, makes herself a simple dinner, and settles into the rocking chair her own mother left her, wondering when Tyler will call. Tyler, now 27 and living in the city several hours away, has built a life that his mother could only dream of when she was his age. His apartment overlooks busy streets filled with opportunities she never had, his career advancing in ways that make her proud, even as they pull him further from her world. When he does think of home, which happens less frequently than it used to, he remembers a mother who was always working, always tired, always telling him to focus on his studies and his future. He remembers her saying, "Don't worry about me," so often that he eventually stopped worrying, assuming that was what she wanted. The distance between them isn't just measured in miles, but in the growing silence that neither of them knows how to bridge. His success feels hollow when he considers how little he knows about the woman who made it possible. Yet reaching out feels increasingly awkward as time passes. The conversations they do have feel stilted, filled with his updates about work and her questions about whether he's eating enough. Both of them dancing around deeper feelings neither knows how to express. The story of Evelyn and Tyler begins to unfold on a particularly quiet Thursday evening, when Evelyn finally decides she can't bear another night of waiting for a call that won't come. She sits at her small kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee growing cold beside her, and pulls out a piece of paper she's been carrying in her purse for weeks. It's nothing special, just a sheet torn from a notebook at the diner, but tonight it represents something more significant than she realizes. The weight of 27 years of unspoken words presses down on her shoulders as she picks up her pen, then sets it down again, unsure of where to begin. For so long, Evelyn had believed that love meant sacrifice without acknowledgement, that a good mother simply endured whatever was necessary for her child's benefit. She had worked those double shifts, not just for the money, though they desperately needed every dollar, but because she wanted Tyler to have opportunities she never had. When her friends talked about their weekend plans or their hobbies, Evelyn would smile and nod, never mentioning that she couldn't remember the last time she had done something purely for herself. The identity of Tyler's mother had become so complete that she had forgotten she was also simply Evelyn, a woman with dreams and fears and stories worth telling. The first realization that would change everything came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over the hills outside her window. She began to understand that Tyler had no idea what her life had been like because she had never told him. When he was young and worried about money, she would reassure him with phrases like, "Don't you worry about that, and everything will be fine." She thought she was protecting him from adult concerns, but instead, she was making her struggles invisible to him. Tyler grew up believing that his mother's life was simple and uncomplicated, that she was naturally happy to work long hours and ask for nothing in return. He never saw her count coins at the end of each month or notice how she would skip meals to make sure there was enough food for him. These unspoken sacrifices, offered with such quiet dignity, remained completely hidden from the person they were, meant to benefit. The second truth hit her even harder as she sat there in the growing darkness of her kitchen. In her determination to be everything Tyler needed, she had somehow become invisible as a person he might want to know. She had been so focused on being the perfect provider and supporter that she had erased herself from their relationship. Tyler knew his mother as someone who asked about his life but never shared her own, someone who listened to his problems but never admitted to having any herself. How could he value someone he didn't really know? How could he miss someone who had never allowed herself to be fully present in their conversations? Evelyn realized that in trying to be selfless, she had accidentally made herself seem like she had no self at all. The third painful recognition came as she remembered all the times she had felt hurt when Tyler didn't call or visit, all the nights she had spent wondering why he didn't seem to appreciate everything she had done for him. She had never told him what she needed from him because she had convinced herself that needing anything was selfish. The love she had given came with invisible strings attached, unspoken expectations that Tyler could never meet because he didn't know they existed. She expected gratitude for sacrifices he didn't know about, appreciation for struggles she had hidden from him. The resentment she sometimes felt toward him wasn't really fair because she had never given him the chance to respond to her real self. That night, Evelyn made a decision that terrified and liberated her in equal measure. Instead of writing another letter asking Tyler how he was doing or sharing news about the town, she decided to tell him about herself. She wrote about the dreams she had put aside, the loneliness she had carried, the pride and fear she felt watching him build his own life. She told him about the night she had cried in the diner bathroom after a particularly difficult customer, and how she had come home and made his favorite cookies because making him happy was the only thing that made sense of her pain. She wrote about her own childhood, the mother who had been loving but distant, and how she had promised herself she would be different but had ended up repeating some of the same patterns. The letter took her 3 hours to write, and when she finished, her hand was cramped and her heart was racing. She had never been so honest with anyone, let alone with Tyler. The vulnerability felt strange and frightening, like standing naked in a crowd. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was telling the truth about who she really was, not just who she thought she should be as his mother. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, writing his address with shaking hands. Whether he would respond was uncertain, but something important had shifted inside her simply by writing those words. 3 weeks later, Tyler called. His voice sounded different, softer somehow when he said hello. He had received her letter and read it several times, he told her. He had never known about her dreams of traveling or her love of painting, interests she had mentioned so briefly in her letter that they were barely more than whispers. He had never realized that his success came at such a personal cost to her, not because he didn't care, but because she had hidden that cost so completely. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had, filled with questions he had never thought to ask and answers she had never thought to give. Tyler admitted that he had always felt like he didn't really know his mother beyond her role in his life. She had been so focused on his needs and his future that he had never learned to see her as a complete person with her own inner world. He realized that his emotional distance hadn't been indifference, but uncertainty about how to connect with someone who seemed to need nothing from him. Her letter had shown him a person he wanted to know better, someone whose sacrifices finally made sense because he could see the woman who had made them. The healing between them didn't happen overnight, and their relationship still requires conscious effort from both of them. But Evelyn's decision to reveal herself honestly created space for genuine connection where only duty and distance had existed before. She learned that being vulnerable wasn't selfish, but necessary for real intimacy. Tyler learned that his mother was not just a support system for his life, but a person deserving of curiosity and care in her own right. Their story illustrates the first crucial insights about why some children don't value their parents as they should. Looking at Evelyn's journey, we can identify 3 fundamental patterns that many parents will recognize in their own lives. First, unspoken sacrifices remain invisible to those who benefit from them. When we hide our struggles in order to protect our children, we also hide the depth of our love and commitment. Children who grow up unaware of what their parents have given up for them cannot appreciate the full scope of that gift. They see the results of our sacrifices, but not the sacrifices themselves, leading them to take for granted what cost us dearly to provide. Second, self-erasure in the name of parenting breeds emotional distance rather than closeness. When we become so focused on our role as providers and caretakers that we lose touch with our own identity, we become less interesting and less relatable to our children. They struggle to connect with someone who seems to have no needs, desires, or internal life of their own. Paradoxically, the parent who tries to be everything to their child can end up being nothing more than a function in their life. Third, Love without clear boundaries and honest communication leads to burnout and resentment on both sides. When we give unconditionally, while secretly hoping for appreciation that never comes, we create a dynamic that satisfies no one. Our children feel burdened by expectations they don't understand, while we feel unappreciated for sacrifices they don't recognize. The solution isn't to give less, but to give more honestly, sharing both our love and our humanity with those we care about most. Evelyn's story shows us that it's never too late to change these patterns, but it requires the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to recognize that being needed isn't the same as being valued. Real appreciation can only exist between people who truly know each other, and that knowledge requires honest communication from both sides. The parent who remains mysteriously self-sacrificing may earn gratitude, but the parent who shares their full humanity earns genuine love and respect. If Evelyn's story resonates with your own experience, I encourage you to subscribe to our channel. For more insights on building authentic relationships with your adult children, to help you see this more clearly, I want to tell you another story that captures a different but equally painful dynamic. Sometimes the problem isn't too much sacrifice, but the wrong kind of love. Not the parent who gives too much of themselves, but the parent who gives everything except what their child truly needs. In a gleaming high-rise apartment overlooking a bustling metropolitan skyline, Caleb stands at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker to life as evening approaches. At 47, he has achieved everything he set out to accomplish when he was a young man starting his career. The corner office, the luxury apartment, the impressive salary that allows him to provide his 16-year-old daughter Mary with opportunities he could only dream of at her age. His refrigerator is covered with receipts from private tutoring sessions, dance classes, and summer camps at prestigious institutions. Every privilege money can buy has been laid at his daughter's feet, yet somehow he feels more distant from her than ever. Mary sits in her bedroom down the hall, expensive headphones blocking out the world as she scrolls through her phone with the practiced indifference of a teenager who has learned not to expect much from conversations with her father. Her room is a testament to Caleb's generosity. The latest technology, designer clothes hanging in a walk-in closet, textbooks for advanced placement courses stacked neatly on a desk he bought because her grades earned her a spot in honors classes. She has everything a parent could think to provide, except the one thing she has stopped hoping for, his genuine attention and emotional presence. The crisis that would force Caleb to confront the hollow nature of their relationship began with a simple question Mary asked over dinner one evening. She had mentioned, almost casually, that her school was hosting a recital where students would perform pieces they had written themselves. She had been working on a song for weeks, she told him, something personal about growing up in the city. The performance was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and she wondered if he might be able to attend. Caleb's response was automatic and devastating in its casual dismissal. He had a critical client meeting that evening, one that could make or break a deal he had been working on for months. Surely she understood that his work was what made everything else possible. Mary's face had remained carefully neutral as she nodded and returned to her dinner, but something fundamental shifted in that moment. The next morning, she informed him that she had decided not to participate in the recital after all. When he asked why, she shrugged and said it wasn't important anyway. That dismissive shrug would haunt Caleb for weeks afterward because he recognized it as an echo of his own response to her invitation. She had learned from him that emotional experiences were less important than practical obligations, that feelings could be set aside when more pressing matters demanded attention. The wake-up call came during their annual holiday trip, a tradition Caleb had maintained since Mary was small. Every December, he would book an expensive resort vacation, always somewhere luxurious and exciting, believing that these grand gestures proved his devotion to their relationship. This year, when he announced their destination with his usual enthusiasm, Mary politely declined. She had made plans with friends, she explained, and would prefer to stay home. The calm certainty in her voice told him this wasn't teenage rebellion, but something far more serious. She genuinely preferred the company of her peers to time alone. With him, sitting alone in his apartment that evening, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, Caleb finally understood what he had been avoiding for years. He had confused providing for Mary with connecting to her, believing that his role as a father was fulfilled by ensuring she had every material advantage. The expensive gifts, the premium education, the luxury experiences he arranged for her were his way of expressing love, but they were a language she had never learned to interpret as affection. Instead, she had learned to see him as a reliable source of resources, but not as someone who truly knew or cared about her inner world. The first painful realization was that material provision had become a substitute for emotional connection in their relationship. Caleb had convinced himself that working long hours to afford Mary's private school tuition was an act of love, but he had never considered whether she would have preferred a father who attended her school events over one who paid for prestigious teachers. He had given her everything money could buy, while withholding the one thing that couldn't be purchased: his time and genuine interest in who she was becoming as a person. The second truth was even more difficult to acknowledge. Their relationship had become entirely transactional, built on an unspoken agreement where his financial support was exchanged for her academic achievement and good behavior. Mary had learned that her father's approval was tied to her performance, that his affection was conditional on her meeting his expectations for success. She received praise when her grades were high, and gifts when she accomplished something notable, but she had never experienced unconditional acceptance of who she was, rather than what she achieved. The third recognition was perhaps the most damaging of all. Caleb realized that his discomfort with emotional vulnerability had taught Mary that feelings were unwelcome in their relationship. When she was younger and had tried to share her worries or excitement about school, he had responded with practical solutions rather than emotional support. When she cried over friendship drama, he had offered to speak to the school counselor, rather than simply listening to her pain. Over time, she had learned that emotional conversations made him uncomfortable, so she had stopped trying to have them. The transformation in their relationship began with a single decision that terrified Caleb more than any business presentation ever had. He cancelled the important client meeting and attended Mary's recital. The awkwardness he felt sitting in the school auditorium surrounded by other parents was nothing compared to the shock of hearing his daughter perform a song about feeling invisible. In her own home, her lyrics spoke of a father who provided everything except presence, of feeling grateful but alone, of wondering what it would be like to have conversations about something other than grades and goals. After her performance, Caleb approached Mary with tears in his eyes, something she had never seen before. Instead of praising her talent or discussing her technique, he simply told her that her song had helped him understand something important about their relationship. He apologized for missing so many moments like this one, for treating their conversations like business meetings, for assuming that financial support was equivalent to emotional support. The conversation that followed was halting and uncomfortable for both of them. But it was the first time they had talked about feelings rather than logistics. The process of rebuilding their connection required Caleb to develop skills he had never learned in his professional life. He had to practice listening without immediately trying to fix or solve whatever Mary shared with him. He had to learn to ask questions about her thoughts and feelings rather than just her achievements and plans. Most difficult of all, he had to become comfortable with his own vulnerability, sharing his fears and mistakes instead of maintaining the facade of having everything under control. Mary's response to these changes was cautious at first. Years of emotional distance not easily overcome by good intentions alone. But gradually, she began to trust that her father's interest in her inner world was genuine rather than strategic. She started sharing small things at first, a funny story from school, a worry about a friendship, an idea she was excited about. Each conversation built on the last, creating a foundation for the kind of relationship they had never had before. The holiday trip they eventually took together looked very different from the elaborate vacations of previous years. Instead of an expensive resort, they chose a simple cabin where they could spend time talking without the distractions of luxury amenities and planned activities. For the first time, Mary seemed genuinely happy to be spending time with her father, not because of what he was providing, but because of who he was learning to become in her presence. Caleb's story reveals 3 more crucial insights about why some children struggle to value their parents. First, material provision without emotional presence creates relationships that feel hollow to both parties. Children who receive everything money can buy but nothing of their parents' authentic self learn to see that parent as a provider rather than a person. They may feel grateful for what they receive, but they cannot feel connected to someone who remains emotionally unavailable. Second, transactional parenting erodes the foundation of trust that genuine relationships require. When a child learns that their parents' affection is contingent on their performance, they begin to hide their authentic selves in favor of whatever version earns approval. The parent-child relationship becomes a performance rather than a connection, leaving both parties feeling lonely even when they are together. Third, avoiding emotional vulnerability perpetuates coldness across generations. Parents who are uncomfortable with feelings teach their children that emotions are problems to be solved rather than experiences to be shared. This emotional distance becomes self-reinforcing as children learn not to bring their inner worlds to parents who seem uninterested in anything beyond practical concerns. Caleb's transformation shows us that professional success and parenting success require entirely different skill sets. The qualities that make someone effective in business meetings may actually hinder their ability to connect authentically with their children. Learning to value presence over productivity, relationship over results, and vulnerability over strength requires a fundamental shift in priorities that many successful people find challenging but ultimately rewarding. The father who learns to give himself rather than just his resources discovers that children value authenticity more than affluence, time more than money, and emotional availability more than material provision. Caleb's story demonstrates that it's never too late to change these patterns, but it requires the courage to become vulnerable and the wisdom to recognize that true success in parenting cannot be measured by external achievements alone. Let me share another story that reveals perhaps the most complex dynamic of all, where love becomes so entangled with control that it strangles the very relationships it seeks to protect. Sometimes the greatest acts of devotion create the deepest resentments, and the most well-intentioned sacrifices become the heaviest burdens. For those we seek to help, on the edge of a windswept coastal village, where salt air carries the sound of waves crashing against weathered cliffs, Nora tends her small herb garden behind a cottage that has been her sanctuary for over 6 decades. At 61, she moves with the careful precision of someone whose body has carried more responsibility than it was designed to bear, her hands gentle with the plants that respond to her care in ways people sometimes don't. The garden represents everything she has learned about nurturing, patience, consistency, knowing when to support and when to step back. If only human relationships were as straightforward as coaxing life from soil. The cottage holds memories that span 3 generations, each room a testament to the sacrifices that have defined Nora's adult life. The nursery she hastily prepared. 24 years ago, when her 17-year-old daughter Maeve arrived on her doorstep, pregnant and terrified, still bears traces of the urgent love that transformed her retirement plans into a second round of motherhood. The living room where she spent countless nights rocking baby Ella while Maeve finished high school, and later. College is now filled with the silence of holidays spent alone. Family photos, the only witnesses to conversations that should have happened but never did. Maeve, now 42 and established in her career as a social worker 3 hours away in the city, carries her own complicated relationship with the mother, who saved her from what could have been a devastating derailment of her young life. Her professional success stands as a monument to Nora's determination that her daughter would not be defined by a teenage mistake. But the cost of that salvation weighs heavily on both women in ways neither fully understands. The gratitude Maeve feels for her mother's support is matched only by the resentment she harbors for never being allowed to struggle and grow through her own challenges. Ella, now 24 and just beginning to establish her independence, occupies the most complex position of all in this family triangle. Raised primarily by her grandmother, while her mother pursued education and career, she has always felt caught between 2 women who love her, but who cannot seem to love each other without pain. Her childhood was filled with whispered tensions and careful conversations, moments when she sensed that her presence was both a blessing and a burden that nobody wanted to acknowledge directly. The crisis that would force this family to confront their buried resentments began with a simple phone call that Nora had been hoping to receive for months. Maeve called to inform her that she would not be coming home for the holidays this year, citing work obligations and travel complications that sounded more like excuses than explanations. When Nora pressed gently for the real reason, Maeve's carefully controlled voice finally cracked, revealing years of frustration that had been building. Beneath the surface of their polite but distant relationship, the conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had, filled with accusations and hurt feelings that had been festering for decades. Maeve accused her mother of being controlling and critical, of never allowing her to make her own mistakes or find her own way as a parent. She spoke of feeling like a guest in her own daughter's life, of watching from the sidelines as Nora made decisions about Ella's upbringing without consulting her. Most painfully, she admitted that she sometimes felt like she had never been allowed to truly grow up because Nora had taken over so completely when the crisis hit. Nora's initial reaction was defensive and hurt. How could Maeve accuse her of being controlling when everything she had done was motivated by love and necessity? When Maeve was 17 and pregnant, someone had to step up and provide stability. When Ella needed consistent care while Maeve was in school, someone had to be reliable. When financial support was needed, someone had to sacrifice their own plans for retirement travel and personal pursuits. The accusations felt like ingratitude of the worst kind, a betrayal of everything she had given up to help her family survive and thrive. But as the conversation continued and Maeve's pain became more evident, Nora began to hear something she had never recognized before. Behind her daughter's anger was a grief for the mother-daughter relationship they had never been able to develop, a longing for the kind of connection that becomes impossible when one person is always the rescuer and the other is always being rescued. Maeve spoke of feeling like she could never be good enough, never make decisions that Nora didn't question or improve upon, never prove that she was capable of handling her own life and her own child. The first painful realization that emerged from this confrontation was that Nora's sacrifices had come with invisible strings attached, expectations that she had never acknowledged even to herself. While she had never explicitly demanded gratitude or deference from Maeve, her subtle disappointment when visits were infrequent or when her advice was ignored had created an atmosphere of obligation rather than choice. Every interaction had become a transaction where Maeve's appreciation was expected payment for Nora's continued support, making genuine relationship impossible. The second truth was even more difficult to accept. In her determination to prevent Maeve from struggling with the consequences of early motherhood, Nora had inadvertently prevented her from growing into full adulthood. By taking over responsibility for Ella's daily care, by making financial decisions without consultation, by stepping in to solve problems before Maeve even recognized they existed, she had created a dynamic where her daughter remained perpetually childlike in their relationship. Maeve's resentment wasn't ingratitude, but frustration at being treated like someone incapable of managing her own life. The third and most devastating recognition was that Nora's own upbringing had shaped her responses in ways she had never examined. Her own mother had been emotionally distant and focused on duty rather than connection, showing love through service rather than intimacy. Without realizing it, Nora had replicated this pattern with Maeve, expressing care through taking control rather than offering support. The generational cycle of women who loved through sacrifice rather than vulnerability had continued despite her best intentions to be different. The healing process began when Nora made one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She called Maeve back and offered an apology instead of a defense. She acknowledged that her need to be needed had sometimes prevented her from allowing Maeve to need herself. She admitted that her fear of watching her daughter struggle had robbed Maeve of the opportunity to discover her own strength. Most importantly, she recognized that her sacrifices, however well-intentioned, had created debts that Maeve could never repay, making their relationship feel more like an obligation than a choice. The conversation that followed was raw and painful, but also liberating for both women. Maeve was able to express not just her resentment, but also her deep love for the mother who had saved her life when she was barely more than a child herself. She acknowledged that Nora's sacrifices had made her success possible, but she also explained how those same sacrifices had made her feel perpetually inadequate and dependent. For the first time, they were able to talk about their relationship as something that could be chosen rather than something that was simply endured. Nora's journey toward letting go of control was neither quick nor easy. She had to learn to bite her tongue when she saw Maeve making choices she disagreed with, to offer support without taking over, to express her needs without making them conditions for her love. The grandmother, who had once orchestrated every detail of family gatherings, had to learn to accept invitations rather than issue them, to participate in her granddaughter's life as a welcomed guest rather than the primary authority. Ella, caught in the middle of this transformation, initially felt confused by the changes in family dynamics. The grandmother, who had always been in charge, was suddenly deferring to her mother, while the mother who had often seemed uncertain was asserting herself in new ways. But gradually, she began to see how much healthier these new patterns were for everyone involved. The tension that had always underpinned family gatherings began to ease as the women learned to relate to each other as adults rather than as rescuer and rescued. The holiday that Maeve had initially refused to attend eventually became the first truly peaceful family gathering they had experienced in years. Instead of Nora planning every detail and Maeve passively participating, they collaborated on creating an experience that honored everyone's needs and preferences. The conversations were more honest, the laughter more genuine, and the love more freely given because it was finally freely chosen rather than obligated. Nora's story reveals 3 final crucial insights about why some children struggle to value their parents appropriately. First, sacrifice offered with unspoken expectations creates guilt rather than gratitude in those who benefit from it. When help comes with invisible strings attached, recipients feel burdened rather than blessed, leading them to avoid the person who helped them rather than appreciate the assistance they received. Second, over-functioning in relationships prevents others from developing their own competence and confidence. Parents who solve every problem and meet every need rob their children of the opportunity to discover their own capabilities. The child who is never allowed to struggle never learns they can survive difficulty, creating dependency rather than strength. Third, unhealed generational patterns repeat themselves in subtle but powerful ways across families. Parents who received love through duty rather than intimacy often express love the same way, creating cycles of emotional distance that persist despite everyone's best intentions. Breaking these patterns requires conscious effort to recognize and change ingrained responses that feel natural but may not be healthy. The transformation in Nora's family shows us that letting go of control is often the greatest gift we can give to those we love. The grandmother who learns to step back creates space for her daughter to step up, while the mother who learns to assert herself models healthy boundaries for her own child. Love expressed through trust and respect creates stronger bonds than love expressed through sacrifice and service alone. If this story resonates with your own family dynamics, please like this video to help others find these insights as well. The stories of Evelyn, Caleb, and Nora reveal 9 universal truths that explain why some of the most loving parents feel the most undervalued by their children. These insights aren't meant to assign blame, but to illuminate patterns that can be changed once they're understood. Each truth represents a bridge between the pain you might be feeling now and the connection you long to have with your child. The first truth is that invisible sacrifices are rarely acknowledged because they remain unseen by those who benefit from them. Like Evelyn working double shifts while telling Tyler not to worry, many parents hide their struggles to protect their children, inadvertently making their love invisible. Your child cannot appreciate what they don't know about, which means your sacrifices need to be shared honestly rather than hidden protectively. The second truth reveals that material provision without emotional presence creates hollow relationships. Caleb's expensive gifts and premium opportunities meant nothing to Mary compared to his absence from her emotional world. If you've been showing love primarily through what you provide rather than who you are, your child may see you as a resource rather than a person worth knowing and valuing. The third truth exposes how unspoken expectations lead to disappointment and resentment on both sides. When you give with secret hopes for gratitude but never communicate your needs, you create impossible standards that your child can never meet. They sense your disappointment without understanding its source, leading to avoidance rather than appreciation. The fourth truth demonstrates that self-erasure prevents true intimacy from developing. Parents who suppress their own identity in service of their children become invisible as individuals worth connecting with. Your child cannot value someone they don't truly know, which means sharing your authentic self is essential for genuine relationship. The fifth truth shows how transactional dynamics weaken the bonds between parents and children. When love becomes conditional on performance or appreciation becomes expected payment for support, relationships lose their foundation of unconditional acceptance. Your child needs to know they are valued for who they are, not just for how they respond to what you've given them. The sixth truth reveals that avoiding vulnerability fosters emotional coldness across generations. Parents who are uncomfortable with feelings teach their children that emotions are unwelcome in their relationship. If you want your child to value you as a person, you must be willing to share your inner world, not just your external support. The seventh truth illustrates how sacrifice with strings attached creates guilt rather than gratitude. Like Nora's unspoken expectations of Maeve's Appreciation, help that comes with invisible obligations, feels more like burden than blessing. Your sacrifices must be offered freely, or they become chains that bind rather than gifts that bless. The eighth truth exposes how over-functioning suppresses mutual respect and appreciation. When you solve every problem and meet every need, you prevent your child from developing their own competence and confidence. They cannot appreciate your capabilities if they never develop their own, making your help feel more like interference than assistance. The ninth and final truth reveals that unhealed generational wounds perpetuate disconnection across families. The patterns you learned in your own childhood often repeat in your parenting, creating cycles of emotional distance that persist despite loving intentions. Breaking these patterns requires conscious effort to recognize and change responses that feel natural but may not be healthy. These 9 truths point toward a path of healing that requires courage, vulnerability, and patience from you as the parent. The relationship you long for with your child is possible, but it may require you to love differently than you have before. Instead of loving through sacrifice alone, you might need to love through authenticity. Instead of loving through provision alone, you might need to love through presence. Instead of loving through service alone, you might need to love through vulnerability. The transformation begins with honest self-reflection about which of these patterns you recognize in your own life. Are you hiding your struggles to protect your child, inadvertently making your love invisible? Are you providing everything except your authentic presence? Are you giving with secret expectations that your child can never meet? The patterns that created distance can be changed, but only if you're willing to examine them honestly and respond differently. Your child's seeming lack of appreciation doesn't reflect your worth as a person or even as a parent. It reflects dynamics that can be healed when you understand what created them. The pain you feel is real and valid, but it doesn't have to be permanent. The relationship you want is still possible if you're willing to build it on a foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and authentic connection rather than sacrifice and service alone. How will you apply these insights to your own relationship with your child? Which patterns do you need to change, and what first step will you take toward building the connection you both deserve? The choice to love differently, to show up authentically, and to create space for genuine relationship is yours to make. If this content has inspired you to see your relationship with fresh eyes and hope for healing, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on building authentic connections with the people you love most.